Hola, my name is Violeta Encarnación, and this is how I create.
Welcome to This Is How We Create, a show that digs deeper into the creative life of contemporary artists of color. Discover what feeds their creativity and how they found or are finding their artistic voice. Through these intimate and candid conversations, you'll gain insights into the lives of creative professionals of color that are hard to find anywhere else. Welcome back to This Is How We Create. My name is Martine Severin, your host. Today we have illustrator Violeta Encarnación on the show. Violeta, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I'm so pleased that you're here. Violeta, could you tell us a little bit about you and about your creative career?
Sure. So at the moment, I work as a freelance illustrator. I graduated from the School of Visual Arts a couple years ago. And since then, I've been working for magazines, for recently children's books, and I am also a licensed tattoo artist.
Violeta, I have to admit that when I came on the show, the doors opened, so to speak, I thought I would get to see a few of your tattoos.
I see. Well, the funny thing is that I actually don't have very many, and the few that I have is just 3. They're really quite small, which was always a really funny thing between my clients and I, because I would usually be covered up as I was tattooing them. And I would say, don't worry, trust me, that it won't hurt at all. And then by the, middle of the session, they would ask, by the way, can I see some of your tattoos? And when I would show them that they were like the smallest little things, it would always be a laughing moment for all of us, because yes, it's not often that your tattoo artist has a lot less tattoos than you.
That is very funny. We could talk about your childhood and about home. And
Right.
For you, I would think, like many third cultural kids, home is a loaded issue because you grew up in Cuba and moved to the US when you were about 14.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us about some of your childhood memories, about your exposure to art and how that might have influenced how you went into a creative career?
I mean, I definitely feel like it's a huge part of who I am. And many of my most cherished memories are in Cuba, even though I've never been back ever since I left with my family. And that has also created all of these different feelings, complex feelings about who I am and where do I really fit in and how much of me is still back there and what that means for future me, right? But growing up in Cuba, creatively speaking, I was always looking around at what to me always felt like a collage of moments frozen in time. All of the buildings, you had some that were back from colonial times and others from very, very different periods, and also with different levels of care to them, and people also making them work in different ways with clothing lines and vegetation sort of taking over these different structures, and painted over and painted and painted just to kind of keep them looking pristine over time. And so it was always a very colorful place to grow up in, and the vivacious culture and people filled the space very well in my eyes. So it always felt like it was almost part of a musical, with these like very interesting backdrops. And I definitely, anytime I'm feeling stuck in my work, I go back to old photos, old movies I used to watch when I was a kid. And that sort of brings me back to things that always sparked my interest. My family and I moved from Cuba to Spain, where we lived for a year and a half before moving to Miami. And then now I live here. So I've tried keeping a little bit of all of these different places I've lived in throughout the years, but they've also kept a little piece of me, I feel. And that works in many different ways in weaving its way in the type of things that I create, I feel.
Can I ask why you came to the US instead of staying in Spain?
So at the time, for Cubans, it was a lot more difficult to come straight to the US. And my parents also felt that culturally, it would be much easier to integrate ourselves into, a Spanish community rather than the US. The US felt so foreign, not just because of the language, but also growing up in Cuba, you're sort of taught all these different things about the US that puts a lot of Cubans off right away. It's a big step to make the choice to come to the US for a lot of Cubans. And so we tried the Spain thing, and we were able to sell our house, and that was sort of the money that we had to make it work. And unfortunately, during that time, there was a huge crisis in Spain, and people that have been working in companies for 15 years were getting laid off. And so for my family, recent immigrants, it was extremely difficult to find work. And so we stayed pretty much for as long as the money for our house lasted. And then right up until the point that we had enough to get our plane tickets. That was it. So it was definitely not the original plan. And even till this day, my parents are very sad about it, just because the Spanish lifestyle is a lot more similar to our Cuban lifestyle in many ways. And so, and even my mom still to this day, she struggles with the English and doesn't really feel like it's able to express all of her feelings.
And it doesn't quite express, you can't really fully express yourself without tapping into your mother tongue. It's just, I feel that it's really impossible. I'm Haitian. And so whenever I get really fired up, I slip right back. There's no way about it. And I count and do math in Creole or in French.
Yeah.
There are just certain things that my brain hasn't fully processed. How does it come across to you? Are there some ways in which you can only communicate in Spanish?
Oh, definitely. When it is things about my childhood, I find it very difficult talking about them in English. I also count in Spanish, always. I don't know if that will ever go away. And there are also certain words in Spanish that capture a lot of different emotions in one word. And oftentimes I'm trying to explain something to someone that doesn't speak English. And I'm like, there is the perfect word and it's in Spanish. You just got to trust me that this is basically, and then I proceed to tell them 5 different English words to sort of try to get them to understand what I'm trying to say.
You would have moved to the US when you were around 16, maybe?
14. So
14.
I moved out of Cuba when I was 12 and a half.
So then you would have gone directly into high school.
Yes.
Right? Oh,
yes.
boy.
I had 1 year of middle school, the very last year, and then right straight to high school.
How was that experience for you? Because had you already started to learn English at that point?
No. That was it was both extremely exciting, just because my experience of America had been in a huge part from movies, and, high school was the stage for a lot of these different movies that I had sort of grown up watching. And I was very excited to be having my American experience. And the first time I saw a school bus, like a yellow school bus, it was like seeing our celebrity for me. It was it was very amazing. And no, as far as the English, I did not know a single thing in English. While I was growing up in Cuba, it was actually not allowed to be taught English in schools. But luckily, my first encounter with, education in the States, all of my teachers spoke only English, didn't speak any Spanish. And so it was one of those things that you have to learn, or otherwise you can't communicate with anybody. And my mom said to me, you have 1 month to get by grades. That's it. After that, you're back to whatever the highest grades are, because that's it. That's all you get.
Your mom's tougher than me.
She was. And I'm so grateful, because it's the push that you need. And I was put in ESOL, which is, for those that don't know, it's English for non-English speakers. And I remember that I couldn't take any electives because I had to take ESOL. And that was very bothersome, because all of my friends were taking art class, and I wanted to take art class so badly, but I couldn't because I had to do Reading Plus and all these other things.
When did you fall back into art, or when did you start taking art classes?
Well, actually, my dad, in Cuba, he was an artist. He was a painter and an abstract artist, and he would have shows in and outside of Cuba. So I always had an artistic role model in my life. And interestingly enough, I always drew my entire life. And I always found it was a very important part of me. But there came a point where I was very young and I wanted my own thing. For some reason, it felt wrong that if my dad was an artist, then I would become an artist as well. I wanted to figure out a different thing still within the arts. So I started studying music, and I was taking it very seriously through guitar. And that's what I thought I was going to go to school for. But after that last year of middle school, we were looking at magnet schools, and, you have to apply. So it's this very lengthy process, and you really have to think about, what you want to do. And there was this one school, it was called Design and Architecture Senior High School, that really piqued my interest. And it had nothing to do with music. And it was sort of the first step towards showing me that I really was an illustrator at heart, right? But I always drew, always. It was my safe space. And that's another thing that later, when it becomes your career, it's something that you have to sort of relearn how to find that safe space when you're all of a sudden getting paid for it and having people comment on it all the time.
How did you end up going to SVA?
In my high school, they offered a scholarship program when you were in your third year. If your teachers felt like you were performing well, they would pick, I believe, 2 students per major in the sophomore class and the junior class. And I was one of the selected ones in junior year. And they either sent you to SVA or to Parsons. And I was sent to SVA. It was my first time in the city, my first time also experiencing what my life after high school could look like. And it was also in the summer. So Cuban me, I did not know what was waiting for me. When the winter came, I felt cheated after that first blizzard hit me. But I fell in love. I fell in love with the city. I fell in love with the energy of everybody that was on that pre-college program, how excited they were about creating and how hard they were willing to work for their dreams, because an art career to so many feels like a dream, right? And so I couldn't stay away. I was like, I need to be here.
So while you're at SVA, you start tattooing. Is it while you were at SVA, or was this in high school?
This was at SVA.
Okay.
This was at SVA. This was after we had a show showing our junior projects. And I received an email over the summer from the manager of this new tattoo shop that was opening up in the city. And he said that he had seen my work from that show, and that they were willing to offer me a free apprenticeship program. And that if I liked it, I could stay working as a tattoo artist with them. And I never say no to anything. So I said yes. And tattoos had always interested me, not so much as to get covered in them, but I love designing around interesting shapes. And what's a more interesting shape than the human body? So I started taking their apprenticeship program all throughout the summer. And I tried graduating as soon as possible, because once you graduate, you can get your license and you can start charging. And so it seemed like a great way of supporting my college education with a little bit of extra money and also getting to do a creative job. And so I ended up graduating in about 4 weeks, the program, and started working nonstop. And funny enough, then during my senior year of college, I was going to school in the mornings. And then right after school, I would go to the tattoo studio with my clients, and I would leave around 1 a.m., 2 a.m. every day of the week, except on Sundays. And that was fantastic because it was go, go, go. But it definitely got to a point where I had no creative juice left. And I was sort of sitting in front of my university assignments for my portfolio. And, you have to put this thing together because you're graduating. And I was feeling that a lot of that stamina was running out, and was a bit confused for a period of time as to what my path was going to be once I graduated.
Were you able to identify that illustration was a path for you early on in your education at SVA, or did that happen later on for you as towards graduation?
That is actually a really good question. And the answer is a bit complex just because at SVA, I knew what the major was and I knew it was called illustration. And I knew that out of all the different things that I could be studying, that was the one that aligned with sort of the place that I saw myself in the best, because I didn't quite feel like a designer. I didn't quite feel like I had the structure to be a designer, but I also I needed more structure than what the fine artist looked like to me. Right. So I felt like the natural place to be was illustration, but I didn't really comprehend how far illustration actually goes. I didn't really understand all the potential that this career has and how many different things can mean illustration. So that was actually something that I've gotten more familiar with over the last 2 years, which is after I graduated. So I didn't really see the practical applications of my work besides just for magazines and books until after graduation.
So tell us a little bit then about your freelance career thus far. On the back of what you've just said in terms of your understanding of what illustration is about, what are some of the assignments and jobs that you've gotten since you graduated?
So some of the jobs, that's one of the beautiful things, that they just encompass so many different fields. Sometimes one of my first paid jobs was to do an animation for a music video. And that was super exciting. And again, because I don't seem to know how to say no, I jumped on it and I was very excited to see how I could make my illustrations move. And it was a super fun project, and it actually showed me that I really enjoyed animating. And it is something that I still do today, on and off, whenever I do have time. And so that's one of those jobs. I've also been asked to do illustrations for magazines to go along an article, sort of to call your attention and, entice the reader. Most recently, I've been invited to work on 3 picture books, which is a whole other beast. These are projects that last sometimes 2 years, and you're just wrestling with the same ideas for longer periods of time, which has also taught me a lot, not just about me, but about the illustration career in general. Well, yeah, tattooing. Tattooing to me, that also falls within illustration.
I would love to hear more about the books that you're illustrating, because we have a lot of different artists who've come on the podcast. And this season, it's the illustrator season. I would say it's the illustrator and graphic designer season. And we've had so many amazing illustrators, such as yourself, come on the show. And I always ask about how they approach illustrating a book. I know that you don't get as much leeway because it's a brief, it's set, but I'd love for you to talk about what your process is when you are working with a publisher on a book.
It's a very fun experience. At least it has been for me. And it's interesting because most people think that they tend to be more restrictive, and sometimes they can be, certainly. But in my experience, they have actually been more open to my input than some of the other fields in which I've been able to collaborate in. The thing with picture books is that the illustrations are such a big part of the story. And in many publishers treat it as you being 50% of the book, because the author brings in a beautiful story, but the way that the readers are going to interpret the story is sometimes very strongly influenced by the images. Many of these readers are very young, and usually their parents are the ones reading the words while they're looking at the images. And so there is, well, of course, the editors and the art director are working with you to sort of pull you back if in any moment you might be taking the story a little bit too far away from what the text is saying. They actually, in my experience, again, they have very much encouraged your imagination and your input to see how far you can take these words in a way that a child or a young reader might interpret it in an exciting way, right? Many of the topics that the books I'm working on currently deal with are topics of loss, pain, families getting separated. And these are topics that for children to be able to talk about in a productive way, you have to be able to tell them with some sort of softness while still being specific. So it's a dance, push and pull, and that's why it's a team effort. You have the writer's path that they have laid out for you, and then the art director and the editor sort of guide you through, and you can really try to make this message come across to whoever's reading it.
It does sound like that's a long process.
Yes. It is a very, very long process. And, a lot of times you figure out that you've sort of walked too far off in any given direction, and you sort of have to retrace your steps and try it again. But there's a lot of time built into a lot of these contracts so that, it's designed for you to be able to try different things. Again, not always. Some projects are a little bit faster than others. And something that is super, super helpful is that at least I work with an agent. And so I'm also very new to the publishing world. I'm working on 3 books right now, but I haven't finished any of them. So I don't have a finished project that I can come back to you and say, oh yeah, so this is what the process was like from start to finish. Half of the experience, I don't know what that's going to look like yet, but at least the negotiations and making myself understood, and also understanding the brief and the expectations, that has been made easier, I think, through having an agent that sort of, kind of interpret different things for me, and also help me communicate the things that are important to me to my editor and my art director as well. So it's always nice to have in publishing, I find, somebody that can sort of aid you in those relationships.
What's a surprising lesson that you've learned through this process?
There's a lot of lessons since I'm so
Tell
new.
me all of them.
I never thought that I would be illustrating children's books. Definitely not this soon. I felt like I needed to sort of earn my stripes a little bit more before anybody would trust me with a book. So it was definitely a surprise. That in and of itself was a surprise, that I was being welcomed into these fantastic projects. And many of it, I had to figure out as I went, how it was the best way for me personally to work in these projects. But that's kind of how it's always been for me. That's how I learned how to animate with that music video, that they just liked my illustrations. They said, could you make these animated? And I said, yeah, sure. And I just sort of had to learn as I went with that project. With the tattoos, it was the same. And now that's been my experience with this one. So one thing is always be up for anything. Even if you don't feel like you're ready, if somebody else is giving you the trust and is giving you the platform to sort of figure it out, of course, never overextend yourself if you feel like it's way beyond you. But, be open to the opportunity to be surprised and surprise others in the process. So that's a big one. I also feel like I'm still learning to focus on myself and what makes sense to me. So often we compare ourselves to not just the quality of work that other people produce, but also their speed, their quantity. And while it's always great to listen to how other people work and what works for them, always test it out, and whatever doesn't serve you, you got to let it go. Because sometimes I have definitely seen myself get stuck in certain projects because I wanted to fit into somebody else's timeline, while I should have really been listening to what works for me. So I think I'm going to leave those 2 as the biggest things that I've learned.
When you got the first book, when they reached out for you to illustrate the first book, what was your thought, and how did they find you? Tell me how it all started?
So with that particular project, I had just signed with my agent. I was very eager, very excited, but I was also not expecting anything right away. Again, because I didn't have any books to show for yet. So I knew that sort of getting publishers interested was going to be a bit more, a little bit harder, right? And so my agent basically created a letter to a mailing, to send out to his mailing list with my work, my name, a little bit about what I'm interested in. And so he sent that out, and we waited and waited and waited. And then the first book reached out, and they were interested in seeing some samples from me. So essentially, they wanted to see me illustrate a scene from the manuscript. They sent me a piece of the manuscript, and they wanted to see how I would handle the relationship of the main characters. So they wanted character studies, and they wanted them to interacting based on the writing, because I didn't have any children in my portfolio, and I didn't have any older men in my portfolio, and they were completely fair to ask, because again, not even I knew what my children and my older men looked like, because I hadn't developed that part of my portfolio yet. And they offered to pay if they ended up going in a different direction. So it felt like there was nothing to lose. So I worked on those for them. I sent them to my agent, and we sent them along, and we didn't hear back for weeks. And so I said, okay, this is fine. This is okay. It's just the first one, it's fine. But I nudge my agent. I say, hey, could you maybe try to ask them for some feedback, just so that I can learn and know, more of like what this side of the illustration world is sort of looking for. And so he reached out, and they said, well, they came back with some pointers, and they said, look, we understand if she doesn't want to do any more samples, but if she was open to doing some, we'll take a look at them. And I really wanted this book. I really wanted the book. And I also really wanted to prove to myself that I could do this. I was coming from editorial illustration, which the medium is completely different, and the messages that you're trying to communicate are completely different. And so I gave it another go. I added a bunch of bright colors, and I sort of also got to know the characters a little bit more, because I had to redraw them. And I sent those over, and I said, well, if this is a no, then I'll move on, and that's fine. And they came back and they loved them, and they said, yes, this is what we want, and we want to go with you. And I could not believe it. I still don't believe it.
Oh, so your parents must have been so excited, your dad in particular.
Yes.
What did they say?
Well, the first thing they said was, you see, we told you. In hindsight, they're the wisest people on earth. Because of course I went to them and I said, well, I don't know. I don't think they're going to like them, because the other ones they didn't like. And of course they know best. And they say, you see, I told you, te lo dije. Of course. But they were very, very excited. They were really proud. I also feel, especially for my mom, since she's not an artist herself, this is going to be a physical thing. It's going to be a book. You can look at it. You can touch it. So for her, it feels like a very tangible sign of progress. It's almost like, I tell her it's like a report card, it's something she can, hold. So it was easier for her to understand, as well as like a milestone for me, which was very special. And the story is very close to the stories about a Cuban family, which was completely by accident. The writer is Cuban, and we didn't know. And, it was a happy accident. I know. And so it hits really close to home in many ways. And so it's a super special project, and they feel it. And I mean, everything I do, I just, deep down is just to thank them, to make them proud. People say that you should do things for yourself. And of course I enjoy what I do. I think it's the love of my life, but it wouldn't matter nearly as much if they didn't love it, and they didn't love watching me happy doing what I do.
Violeta, you said that you are working on several projects, several books at the same time.
Yes.
So what's the timeline in terms of when these offers came in? So was this the first one?
Oh, this was the first one. This was the first offer. It was not the first one that I signed, just because of the process of sending the samples. But this was the first one. And I believe it's also the first one that will come out. So it is set to publish in the summer of 2025. And I received the offer around May of 2023, just so that you can have an idea of what that looks like. is set to come out in the fall of 2025 and the next one sometime in 2026. So we're talking long-term projects. And a lot of the process looks like waiting. You receive the manuscript, you get started on your sketches. And once you send the first round of sketches, you're waiting. And often they could take anywhere from a couple weeks to a couple months to get back to you. Sometimes the writer needs to finish up part of the manuscript. So you might be waiting on the writer to finish. Sometimes other things happen in-house. I haven't personally experienced this, but many of my illustrator friends have told me about their experiences and how their books have gotten postponed through a lot of different things that are out of their control. So it doesn't look like you sitting at your desk drawing every single day for 2 years. Not at all. And it's interesting because a lot of times I have gotten feedback on sketches that I made months and months ago. And I look at them and I'm like, I don't know who did this. I don't know who she was. I want to start over. But at that point, you just have to keep going. And that in and of itself is a very interesting experience that is very different from the other illustration jobs I've been involved in, for sure.
That's so interesting. And to think about the wait, right? These books aren't going to come out until next year. And then there's another one that's not going to come out until the year afterwards.
Right.
And you think about, how jobs come in. It's when somebody sees the proof that you can do something. That's when you get asked to do more of the same.
Yes.
So that must be an interesting place for you to be in.
Absolutely. And even in terms of getting paid for your work, it gets split up into, however long you're working on these projects, right? So it's not that you have like this really big payday or anything like that, and so if dates get pushed, then so does getting paid. And so you have to, it's not just playing around with your schedule and how busy you are in between projects, which also, funny enough, there's a magical way in the universe that when you have a deadline for one project, that's when you get all these other projects in and they want the same deadline. Usually it's like, I'm usually like at 3 months of nothing, radio silence. And then in 3 weeks, I have those 3 months worth of work due. But yeah, it's one of those things that you have to figure out as a freelancer to juggle not just your schedule, but also how these different paydays are lining up and what to do when there isn't enough and what to do when there's a lot. Yes.
Oh, cash flow.
There's a word.
Yeah. I've always found cash flow to be really difficult. And not only the cash flow, but also the mindset of how do you plan your life around the fact that you might get a job here and then there, or a bunch of jobs across 2 or 3 months, but then the rent is due every month.
Right.
So how do you do it?
Yeah. The math doesn't add up.
So you're doing these projects and also having other freelance jobs and tattooing. So are you tattooing full time?
No. I actually had a very unfortunate situation with tattooing that I was overworking my hands a lot. And I actually developed a carpal tunnel through it, which anybody that knows what that feels like, it's not very fun. And so I actually had to take a break from it for a while. And now I only do appointments sporadically whenever I have some time, but I'm very careful about how I schedule it now, just because that time during my senior year when I was working, in school, which is drawing all day. And then after 5 p.m. or so, I would go to the tattoo studio and tattoo, not little pieces. I was doing big, I think my longest session was 12 hours without stopping. And then the next day we had part 2. So it was another 12-hour session. And so it's not just the same as drawing. You're also having to pull the skin in a way so that the lines are crisp and also, you're making sure that your client is comfortable. So a lot of times you have to get into these very strange positions. So, and I was very careless about my hands. They had never been an issue before. And to me, it seems like it's just drawing, but it isn't. And so now I have to pull back on the tattooing, but I do freelance all the time. And I actually love to get to do books, which are such a long-term project with freelance editorial things sprinkled in between, that the turnaround is very, very quick. You have to think on your feet and get back to people very quickly. It sort of keeps things moving. And it forces you to stay on top of what's going on. Because as much as I like to read the news, there's so much information out there, not just politically speaking, but in very random things that you get to learn when you're doing pieces for magazines. And then I'm that annoying person at gatherings. It's like, did you know that? Just from something on an article.
Violeta, I'm curious, how are your hands doing now?
They're doing okay. Thank you for asking. They're doing great. I don't struggle with it nearly as much anymore. And I also know how to pace myself better so that it doesn't become an issue.
As a photographer, I got what was called frozen shoulder because I was carrying all my equipment on my shoulders. And I got to a point where I couldn't lift my arms higher than this, and it was just really too bad. And it took me quite a bit of time, about a year of physical therapy to get back. And that said, you learn you don't carry anything on your body. I do not carry anything on my body anymore. I don't know if you could peek. I have a little suitcase back there that has my think tank roller that has all of my gear in it because I'm not putting it on my body. Lesson learned.
Yeah.
One of the questions I have for you is if you could talk to us about your color palette, Violeta, because it's so pretty and it's saturated. Can you tell me how you came about developing that color palette?
Sure. I love that you see my work as having a color palette. It was a huge insecurity of mine for a long time because for a while, the first 2 years of my time at SVA, I worked primarily in graphite. So I stayed very far away from color. It scared me and terrified me. I admired people that had beautiful, vibrant colors that harmoniously created atmosphere. And I was so jealous because my work, it was black and white, which it could be very profound, but it lacks a bit of that touch of reality, of things that excite me and seems to excite a lot of people, which is color. And so I sort of very hesitantly began dipping my toes in color during my time at SBA. And many of them were very awkward combinations of color. It was me just sort of throwing spaghetti at the wall. And oftentimes I would look at artists that I admired that have fantastic use of color and sort of literally taking their colors and putting them on my work, but having zero understanding of hue or such, nothing. I was just, these colors are pretty, let's put them here. And of course it didn't work. And so it was a lot of stopping trying to be these other people. There's a big thing with that, of course. And it was have to also go back to the beginning, right? How about we just draw this thing from life exactly as you see it with the colors that you see it? And slowly started to understand the relationships between colors. I took a few classes that focused just on color theory. I feel like that's a step that you cannot skip if color is something that is interesting to you. And so that was a huge helper just for me to understand what color does, what kind of emotion it can draw from you. And then now every time I sit down to do a piece, I do my sketches in black and white because that helps me come up with a composition that makes sense and that is nicely balanced. But when it comes to the color, I'm asking myself all these different questions, like what's the most effective way of coloring this piece so that it has the atmosphere, it has the feeling that I'm trying to get across. And that's sort of where the color palette is born then. And a lot of my inspiration comes from nature. I wouldn't say that I use very weird colors, like I don't put pink in a flower stem. But within that, there's a lot of experimentation that you can do. And so it's very nice. Like whenever I feel stuck with colors, I just go back to reality and then start to pull it far from there again, little by little.
I'm always surprised when I ask questions, how people answer them, because I thought you would say something completely different.
Really?
Right? I thought you were going to say, I grew up in Cuba. There were colors all around me. And I thought you were going to say yes. And I take photos from my time growing up in Cuba, and that inspires how I do shading and add texture to my work. That's what I thought you were going to say. You did not say that.
I did not, did I?
That's so interesting, because I thought for some reason, like, oh, she grew up in Cuba. She would know color. She would know how colors just go together without even trying or taking a color theory class. Like, it's in her. She is Cuban.
Not at all. But it's interesting you say that, because something that did come from Cuba 100% is the textures that I use and the way that I think about surfaces. That is 100% from there. Like patterns, all of my patterns, I'm 100% sure that they come from things that I gravitated towards as a kid. Tiles. She was full of tiles and very colorful, vintage, that combine shape, and the design that they have is very special. There's a lot of Art Deco elements sprinkled throughout Havana and Cuba in general. And those are very, very present in my work. But that shows up more in the design and in the textures that I utilize, not the color at all. And it's interesting again, because I've always been very, very attracted to color. And I know that's not a special thing. I feel like we all are, right? But it was something that scared me a lot. I felt like I could get values right very well, and I could get likenesses, represent reality pretty well. But when it came to being creative with color, it always felt like this untamable beast to me. And it's only been recently that I've sort of tried to put that notion aside and sort of relearn it. But yes, not the Cuban. I wish it had been like that.
I think my love of color is from the Caribbean, is from Haiti. And so I have a natural intuition in terms of how, what colors go together. But going back to what you were saying, it does have to do with nature and not from thing that happens in my brain. It's just that you observe how colors relate to each other, and nature does a really great job of telling you what goes together and what doesn't.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that that's also when you look at somebody's body of work, you can see what sort of colors they're comfortable with. And that also lets you know what sort of environment they're comfortable with, I find, and what sort of things they gravitate towards as well. And it's interesting because many of my friends, their environments, their studios, their clothing, everything sort of starts to look like their work, and vice versa, because it's just such a big part of their identity and things that, again, come naturally to them. Yes, I guess my color palette is a lot more related to things that I see on the daily, and me really seeing, let's make this person blue. And although maybe one day. Yes.
Violeta, when you are not working on a book or doing illustrations or animations, what do you do off the clock?
Well, one of my favorite things to do is cooking. And I actually get sad when I'm very busy and I don't get to cook as much, or I have to do now there's this thing called girl dinner. That is just throwing together chickpeas from a can and, something random and eating that just as is. It is quite sad anytime I have to do that because I'm in a big rush. But I love taking my time and doing these very elaborate recipes. And not all of them turn out as well as I would like, I will admit. But, I'm always up for trying new things. And anytime I feel homesick, I call my grandma and I make her walk me through her recipes. They never taste the same. I don't know what she does, but anytime she makes anything, it's just the best thing I've ever had in my life. And anytime I try to recreate that here, it never quite comes out. But that is one of my favorite things to do. I love cooking for friends, for people that I love. I love to take care of my plants as well. If I could grow a whole garden and I did try to grow tomatoes in New York. It did not work. It's so sad. Very small spaces don't make good tomatoes in my experience. But I also try to, as of recently, I've started to go camping. I've always been terrified of, I love nature, but I've been terrified of it forever. I don't do spiders. I don't do snakes or anything that moves, out and about in the wild. But I've been trying to harden myself up around the edges a bit.
How was your first camping experience?
The first part was terrifying and, leading up to me sleeping there. But then waking up in the morning with the feeling that you didn't die, it makes you see the place that you camped at completely different. It was, and I think that's the moment where I fell in love with it. And I said, okay, I'm going to start doing this from now on more often, because going over there, I had my hiking poles and I was like, tapping the ground before I stepped on it to, make sure that any animal that was there would know and leave. And then when I was coming back the next day, I was just not looking at the ground at all. I was like looking up and listening to the birds. It was such a nice, freeing experience. I can't tell you I would touch a spider yet, but maybe one day.
So tell us what's next for you. What do you have coming up?
The biggest thing right now that I have coming up is the books. I have one that's called Together We Remember that comes out in the summer of 2025. It feels so far away. And the other one is called Dinosaurs to Dragons, and it comes out in the fall of 2025. There's a third one that hasn't been officially announced yet, but I hope we will soon. And I'm very excited for it as well. And that's the one that comes out in 2026. Very, very excited for those projects. And then in between here and then, I want to do a shop update very soon. I've been doing ceramic pieces that I can't wait to share. Yes, I love to fill my time with as many random things as possible.
Oh gosh, I think that I would love that. When you have your shop updated, let us know. We will post and feature it, because your shop is so cute and it's on Etsy, right?
Yes.
Hi there. I have a quick favor to ask you before you go. If you're loving the show, would you mind taking a quick second to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite go-to podcast app? Here's the thing. Those reviews are like magic fairy dust. They help other creatives of color discover our show and tap into their own artistic superpowers. While you're at it, why not subscribe to our Substack newsletter, Creative Matters? Creative Matters is like a weekly dose of inspiration delivered straight to your inbox. You can find the link to subscribe in the show notes. All right, that's all that I have for you today. I can't wait to see you on the next episode. Bye.